Humanity's expansion into the stars faced countless obstacles over the centuries, from monumental technological hurdles to encounters with hostile and sometimes aggressive alien races. Yet, some historians say that the most significant obstacle was humanity's unwillingness to set aside centuries of ingrained cultural differences and ally with each other. In 2380, Earth's nations came together and, following lengthy and contentious negotiations, agreed to a previously unfathomable outcome to unify under one central government that would lead humanity's expansion into space. While many celebrated the creation of the United Nations of Earth, UNE for short, others decided to fight back, leading to a bloody and contentious 4 years of war and unrest between 2380 and 2384 that came to be known as the Unification Wars. This time period started with the Stanley Mutiny. The warship Stanley was originally commissioned and put into service by the nation of Aimkiano in 2369. Still in excellent condition, the battle cruiser's ownership and command was transferred to UNE in 2380. However, more than a third of the crew, including the captain, resigned prior to the transfer, and they pledged loyalty to their homeland, refusing to join the nascent UNE Navy. New naval recruits were assigned to fill vacated positions in an effort to embody the multilateral and multicultural makeup of the UNE Navy. Yet, these changes angered the remaining members of the Aimkiano crew and led to clashes that resulted in multiple disciplinary reports being filed for fighting and insubordination. With rumors swirling that Stanley's Aimkiano crew members would be separated and reassigned to different ships, a contingent of them took matters into their own hands. On October 20, 2380, an armed group of Aimkiano crew members mutinied and took control of their ship. Their initial plan was to use Stanley to liberate their country from the tyranny of the UNE, as they put it, by attacking a number of Earth's major cities if their demands for the return of Aimkiano sovereignty were not met. In a heroic and highly successful operation, the UNE Navy disabled and recaptured Stanley without a single casualty. Those responsible for the mutiny were put on trial, and most were given lenient sentences to show compassion and caring for those who took part in this, except for the three ringleaders, who received harsh sentences to send a message to other anti unification sympathizer organizers. Unfortunately, the actions of Stanley's crew would inspire others to follow suit. On December 9, 2380, two UNE warships, Panjawani and Cassano, vanished during a routine patrol. The Navy quickly dispatched ships to determine their fate, only for the search party to be ambushed. The crew and captains of the Panjani and the Cassano had secretly orchestrated a defection, and, after repelling the search party, broadcast a message calling on other UNE vessels to join them in rejecting the hegemonic authority of the UNE. Over the following week, four more warships would defect and join a loose alliance, whose main demands centered around the dissolution of the UNE. However, the group would never fully unify, as each ship continued to operate under its own command and make additional demands specific to its crew's national origin, even sometimes in direct opposition of one another. Desperate to not lose any more ships to mutiny, the Navy took drastic steps, reassigning crew members of all in its remaining vessels to ensure people who were from the same former country or from a previously crewed together were separated. This slowed its response in neutralizing the rogue ships, but some believe it kept the Navy vessels together better, if only if they just didn't defect. Meanwhile, the six allied yet independently operated anti-unification warships baited the Navy into skirmish after skirmish by advancing towards cities on Earth and Mars, or the jump to Croshaw. The Navy would briefly engage the ships, but avoid an all-out battle. It claimed to be prioritizing the protection of civilians and cities, but Navy brass also worried that destroying the warships would create martyrs for the anti-unification movement and wanted the warships returned to the UNE fleet undamaged. The Navy's focus on disabling and recapturing the warships frustrated many and allowed the rebellious ships to escape on several occasions. When one skirmish resulted in major damage to a Navy warship and the loss of 5 crew members, the Navy adjusted its tactics and went on the offensive and began picking off the anti-unificationist ships rather than waiting for them to threaten territories. 4 were disabled and captured, and 2 were destroyed. Panjwani held out the longest and was finally destroyed on March 22, 2381. Yet it wouldn't be long before the war would reemerge on a new front. Tensions remained high throughout the middle of 2381, with a growing contingent of anti-unificationists publicly expressing their desire to dissolve the UNE. Intelligence services monitored their chatter and noted a common belief was that the defecting warships failed in their objectives because they lacked a landing zone to repair and resupply. In June of 2381, an intelligence report noted the frontier settlement of Syrtis on Mars, home to a large contingent of expats from Sumercandia who opposed the dissolution of their country, had opened their city to anti-unificationists and allied to any former nation. Syrtis' population had dramatically increased, and the settlement began expanding and strengthening its fortifications. When illegally obtained military-grade anti-aircraft turrets were installed in early August, the UNE sent in the military to retrieve the weapons only to be met by force. The unexpected level of resistance surprised the military, who decided against escalating the incident and endangering Syrtis civilians. Instead, the military pulled its forces back, encircled Syrtis, and waited. Besides keeping anyone from entering or leaving Syrtis, the UNE Navy instituted a no-fly zone and blocked transmissions to stymie communications. Early UNE assessments believed that the settlement had strategic food and water reserves to last 6 months. Yet nearly a year later, the residents of Syrtis remained defiant and refused to surrender. Despite the settlement's communications being cut off, civilian observers monitored the settlement and the UNE's actions and relayed daily updates on the standoff to anti-unificationist circles. The incident became known as the Siege of Syrtis and grew into a rallying cry and recruitment tool for anti-unificationist movement, which by now had solidified into a single united group representing people from all of the former nations of Earth, known as the Anti-Unification Alliance, AUA. Some members of the UNE Council believed that the standoff made the government look weak and unable to enforce the laws Syrtis was subject to, so they ramped up pressure on the military to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. When residents inside Syrtis refused to negotiate with the UNE, claimed the government had no authority over the settlement, several psychologically stressful tactics were deployed, including blasting of loud music, night-to-day aerial bombardment to create a canopy of noise, and light at night to try and exhaust the inhabitants for days on end. None of these ploys convinced the residents of Syrtis to give in, and only generated more support for the AUA and ire for the UNE government from the wider civilian population. The UNE Council became convinced that the optics of the standoff were helping anti-unificationists more than anything, ordered the military to end it. On January 4, 2383, the military sieged the settlement in the middle of the night and, after a brief yet bloody battle, took control of Syrtis. And of course, our story does not end in Syrtis. The bloody end of the situation in Syrtis drew widespread criticism and strengthened support for the Anti-Unification Alliance, which also evolved its tactics and communication methods. Peaceful and persuasive AUA members became the face of the movement. They held rallies, wrote op-eds, and made constant media appearances to promote their position that the UNE was an imperialist and unelected power structure with no real authority over everyday people. Meanwhile, UNE analysts noticed a troubling silence coming from the more militant wing of the anti-unificationist movement and worried something was in the works. They were right to be worried. With measures taken by the UNE Navy to purge and disempower anti-unificationists within their ranks, the AUA focused on building a fleet of personal ships and modifying them with weapon systems, which were uncommon and extremely hard to acquire by civilians of the era. The movement also made inroads and garnered strong support within the burgeoning militia communities of the UNE areas. Following unification, many warships deemed too outdated for the UNE Navy were retained by local governments and deployed to patrol shipping lanes, aid in humanitarian missions, and handle low-level encounters with budding criminal elements. In early 2384, commanders of the makeshift AUA fleet began secretly meeting and plotting with the captains of some of these aging warships. Unlike previous anti-unificationist movements, theirs would be organized and focused on a singular objective. On July 29, 2384, the UNE Navy received word that a militia warship had vanished the previous week and was now approaching New York City. While local air controllers were attempting to contact the ship, it fired upon Navy ships sent to intercept it and then fled. When the Navy mobilized ships in the region to pursue the rogue warship, the rest of the AUA fleet attacked New York City, heading for the same target, the United Nations of Earth Plaza, which housed the main legislature and administrative functions for the new unified government. The mission was simple: destroy the seat of UNE power, then use the ensuing chaos to convince countries and regions to abandon the unified government. Upon realizing the true scope of the attack, the Navy recalled most of its ships to come to the defense of New York City. Though small fleets were left to defend the key military installments of Port Renatus and Mars and Angeli on Croshaw, in case the attack on New York City was a double feint. For hours, the sky above New York City became ablaze in battle. Residents sought refuge in basements and subway tunnels as debris and damaged ships crushed into the city. The Navy rightfully assumed the intended target was the UNE Plaza and put everything into its defense. When it became clear the anti-unificationists wouldn't be able to overcome the Navy's defensive line, they adjusted their tactics to spread maximum fear and chaos by attacking the urban sprawl around the main city. Some of their warships fired randomly upon buildings, while others intentionally crashed into the city instead of surrendering. With the number of AUA ships dwindling, several of the rebellious ships fled instead of surrendering. These ships hid in the outer reaches of the Sol system and even slipped into Croshaw. Knowing no UNE port would ever give them safe harbor, the crews of these ships would go on to form several well-known outlaw gangs, and despite UNE efforts to bring them to justice, many of them became infamous for raiding trading lanes throughout Sol and the system of Croshaw. The fight for New York City finally brought the mainstream anti-unificationist movement to an end. The random and mass destruction wrought on New York City and its surrounding area angered UNE residents and turned the general public against the movement for good. While there would be some small skirmishes and anti-unificationists in the following decades, historians officially consider the fight for New York City as the final battle in the Unification Wars. The destruction to New York City was extensive, yet many famous and culturally significant locations thankfully survived. Today, many historians credit the massive rebuilding effort, including RSI's decision to build a massive headquarters complex where the largest warship crashed, as key to the modernization of New York City, and leading to upgrades and improvements that would solidify the city's status as a political and cultural capital, with one foot firmly in the past and another in the future. While the Unification Wars saw humanity face great divisions and terrible internal strife, the result coalesced support behind and solidified the sovereignty of a human unified government that would boldly lead the species into the wider universe. This has been a reading of out of Jump Point 10.08 that was then posted to the RSI website of the portfolio Unification Wars. This is one of the newer jump points. Please, lore team, keep curating these. Thank you for posting this. Unification Wars is a very interesting time in the Star Citizen history, and I think this is one of those time periods that's exciting and different, and there's a lot of gray area, and it pushed humanity to its extremes. We hear about the external strife that we had with the Tavaran and dealing with the double dealings with the Banu and who are they really dealing with besides us, and the hilarious encounter we had during first contact, etc. And I even think about the Sheehan and all the double dealings there, and where exactly is the edges of humanity, and yeah, not everything is a Van Duel blade or or Tavaran dropship that's coming to get you. Sometimes it can be internal. These countries that make up the UNE at the time, the UNE, and later the UEE, and make the pride of the fleet. This is our legacy. This is our history, and the legacy of this strife is the strong empire that was created through the UEE. So when you fly the space lanes of Stanton, understand that some of this history has direct influences on where we come from. And one day Soul will be inside the game, and no, I don't think they'll render out every single building on Soul, but one of the planetary landing locations, ideally and early on, hopefully when Soul finally comes in, will be New York City, and you can go visit the RSI headquarters, and you can go see some of these the plaques and memorials. I'm sure they will have recognizing the battles of the Unification Wars, and you can also go see Syrtis on Mars. These are exciting places. Are they in the game yet? No. And that's the beauty of lore. It allows you to understand the history of the verse and get a little step closer to it. And I hope that my readings of them kind of bring them to life a little bit. I tried to embrace it and offer some excitement and try to give both sides some perspective and respect. In situations like this where I I have to check my bias at the gate. It is a fictional world that we're embracing, and both sides had their points. So I have to sit there and try to offer how they felt at that moment, and when they felt that fear and anger and upset, and that chance of being able to take the advantage. And I try to capture that in my readings. So understand they do bat for the fences. I have an entire lore catalog as a playlist if you go into my channel, and I'll link it into the description as well if you aren't familiar with that. There's plenty there. So if you like ships, you like just basic lore of the history, or if you like going in depth about everything and just geeking out trying to get ready for CitizenCon or whatever the latest event is when you're hearing this, it's all there. Enjoy it. And of course, the link in the description to the original text that is posted on the RSI website that was created by the CIG lore team. Credit to them for their amazing writing and content. As a reminder, though, not everything that is lore is evergreen. Be prepared for some of the things you learn and some of the changes some of the things that you've come to memorize changed slightly based on the needs of the game, based on the world that's created, based on how Squadron turns out, etc. There needs to be plot twists and things and turns. Sometimes it's for actual lore reasons, like this is the official UEE history. Like this is obviously written. This entire article is obviously written as a Spectrum type dispatch that's supposed to be like an official writing by clearly someone who supports the UEE and obviously the UNE prior to that, and talks about these anti-unificationist people as like the bad people. Like you can clearly see it in the storyline, and you find out at the end why. Um, Towards the end, they go from someone with an actual fair viewpoint to like they literally just commit horrible acts to get their point across and attempt to sow discontent and horror and siege an entire innocent city as revenge for what happened to them at Syrtis. So, yes, that's not great either side, but obviously that was what swayed the author, at least based on how I interpret this. So remember that some of these are written from the perspective of an NPC that's literally in the game or in the verse, an historic person. And sometimes they're written in the past too. So they may be written even just a couple years prior to what modern day is. So at the time of this recording, we're in 2953 into 54, that type of time period. So if you see something that's mentioning an earlier date that it was created, remember that that may be not out of date, but it may be it's kind of like looking at an old newspaper clipping or an old book that was published 10 years ago. There's probably some great information in there, but just beware if it says like current day, this is what's happening. It's like, well, if it's written 4 years ago, it's not current day anymore. So everything up to that point, you can go, okay, well, that's that's this person's perspective. It's capturing that moment up until then. So bear that in the back of your mind when you dive into the lore. The Galactopedia is actually a pretty good resource. It's not perfect, but it's getting pretty good. And that's an official source where they've been quietly kind of taking a lot of the older content and refreshing it. And each week they release the This Week in Star Citizen, and they talk about if they have Galactopedia updates. They do it a few times a month, and you can see in This Week in Star Citizen what the newest refreshed Galactopedias are. And a lot of times I've actually caught them live editing them because I'm a lore hound, a lot like a few of the other fine folks that are in this content world. Um, so just remember that in the back of your mind when you're talking about Star Citizen lore. That'll do it for this one. Thanks again. Be sure to give this a like, drop a comment if you haven't. If you just appreciated it, or if you have some feedback on how I did these. I do bad for the fences, but I do take feedback as well if something's really getting to you. And another thought is if you have a specific topic you want me to cover, let me know. I can certainly do some research and throw something together. Take care. Fly safe.